There comes a time in every man's life when he realizes the world has passed him by. Tom Avery felt that weight settling on his shoulders like winter frost as he rode into Bitter Creek with nothing but regret and an empty wallet. The town folks talked about Black Hollow Ranch and Eleanor St. James, the rich widow who owned it. They said no ranch hand ever lasted working for her. Some quit after a week, others just disappeared, and a few rode off talking about strange things they couldn't explain. Tom was broke and desperate, so when Eleanor offered him the job, he took it. What he found wasn't a haunted ranch or a crazy woman. He found someone as lost as he was, trying to keep her world from falling apart. But what was the real secret behind why no man could survive working at Black Hollow Ranch? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust kicked up by Tom's horse settled slowly in the September heat as he guided his mare through the iron gates of Black Hollow Ranch. The gates themselves told a story-ornate ironwork that had once been painted black, now weathered to rust and neglect. Beyond them stretched a dirt road lined with cottonwoods, their leaves already turning yellow at the edges, whispering secrets in the afternoon breeze. Tom's weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as he took in the sight before him. The ranch house rose from the valley floor like something from a different era, when cattle barons ruled the territory and money flowed like water from mountain springs. 3 stories of timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that could hold a church congregation. But even from a distance, Tom could see the signs of decay-loose shutters, missing roof shingles, and paint peeling like old skin. His last silver dollar pressed against his thigh through his worn pocket, a reminder of just how far he'd fallen. 60 years on this earth, and all he had to show for it was a tired horse, a bedroll, and memories he'd rather forget. The coin had been his father's, given to him on his 18th birthday, with words Tom could still hear echoing in his mind. A man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, son, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for what's right. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, decades later, willing to take any job that would keep him fed and sheltered, even one that came with warnings whispered in saloon corners. As Tom approached the main house, he caught sight of movement on the porch. A woman emerged from the shadows, tall and straight-backed, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun. Eleanor St. James. Even at a distance, she commanded attention not through beauty, though traces of it remained, but through the kind of presence that comes from bearing responsibility and grief in equal measure. She wore a simple black dress that had seen better days, practical boots, and around her neck, barely visible, a thin gold chain that disappeared beneath her collar. Her hands rested on the porch railing, knuckles white with tension as she watched his approach. "You must be Avery," she called out as he dismounted, her voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education, tempered by years of Western living. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind." Tom touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect that came as naturally as breathing. "Ma'am, Tom Avery as promised. I don't make a habit of breaking my word." Eleanor's grey eyes studied him with the intensity of someone who had learned to read men quickly and accurately. She saw the military bearing in his posture, the way he automatically scanned the surroundings before focusing on her, the careful economy of his movements that spoke of hard experience. "No, I don't suppose you do," she said finally. "Pete will show you to the bunkhouse. Supper's at 6 sharp. We'll discuss your duties then." As if summoned by her words, an old man emerged from the barn area, his gait uneven but determined. Pete Morrison had been with the ranch for 15 years, the only hand who'd stayed through Eleanor's recent troubles. His face was leather tough, from decades of sun and wind, his mustache more white than grey, and his eyes held the wary look of someone who'd seen too many good men come and go. "This way, Tom," Pete said, extending a calloused hand. "Welcome to Black Hollow, though I ain't sure congratulations are in order just yet." As they walked toward the bunkhouse, Pete pointed out the various buildings and their purposes. The main barn, solid as a cathedral and twice as large. The machine shed, where rusted equipment sat like the bones of better times. The chicken coop, where a few hardy birds still scratched for existence. And beyond it all, the vast expanse of ranch land, stretching toward the mountains, dotted with cattle that looked too few and too thin. "How long have you been here, Pete?" Tom asked as they reached the bunkhouse, a long, low building that had once housed a dozen men, but now echoed with emptiness. "Long enough to see this place when it was something special," Pete replied, pushing open the door. "Old Colonel St. James, Eleanor's father, he built this ranch from nothing. Came out here after the war with a dream and the backbone to make it real. This was the finest spread in 3 counties. The bunkhouse smelled of dust and disuse, with rows of empty beds and lockers that had once held the belongings of working men. Tom chose a bed near the window, where he could watch the sunrise, and set down his few possessions. "What happened to the others?" Tom asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Pete was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the main house. "Eleanor's had a hard time of it since the fire. Loses herself in grief, and men don't know how to handle a woman's pain. Some couldn't take the sadness of the place. Others got spooked by her midnight walks. Few got bought off by them developers from back east." "Developers?" "Vultures is more like it. Been circling ever since Eleanor's husband and boy died. Figure a widow woman can't run a ranch, and they're probably right. But Eleanor's got her father's stubborn streak, and she'll fight till her last breath before she lets strangers take what her family built." Tom nodded, understanding more than Pete probably realized. He'd seen enough widows during his military service to know that grief could make people do things that seemed strange to outsiders. The question was whether Eleanor St. James was fighting for something worth saving, or just fighting because fighting was all she knew how to do. A bell rang from the direction of the main house, its tone clear and commanding across the evening air. "Supper bell," Pete said. "Hope you got an appetite. Sarah's been cooking for a full crew out of habit, even though it's just been me and her and Eleanor these past weeks." They walked back toward the house as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Tom of campfires and cavalry charges and times when he'd known who he was and what he was fighting for. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, a sharp contrast to the formal coldness of the rest of the house. Sarah Murphy, the housekeeper, was a woman of middle years, with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. She'd been with the St. James family since Eleanor was a bride, and her loyalty ran deeper than any paycheck. "Sit yourself down, Mr. Avery," she said, ladling stew into a bowl. "It's been too long since this table had a proper audience for my cooking." Eleanor entered as they were settling in, having changed from her work dress into something more suitable for dinner. She took her place at the head of the table with natural authority, though Tom noticed she barely touched her food. "Pete tells me you've got military experience," she said without preamble. "Some," Tom replied carefully. "Cavalry mostly. Long time ago." "Good. This ranch needs someone who understands discipline and hard work. The previous hands seemed to think this was some kind of holiday camp." Pete and Sarah exchanged glances but said nothing. Tom sensed there was more to the story than Eleanor was telling, but he'd learned patience in his years of wandering. "What exactly do you need me to do, ma'am?" he asked. Eleanor's fingers absently touched the chain at her throat, a gesture Tom was beginning to recognize as a nervous habit. "Everything, Mr. Avery. The fences need mending, the cattle need gathering, the hay needs cutting. This ranch is falling apart, and I need someone who can help me hold it together." There was something in her voice, a note of desperation, carefully controlled but unmistakable to someone who'd heard it before. Tom had made the same plea himself, in different words and different circumstances, when his world had been falling apart. "I'll do what I can," he said simply. After dinner, Tom walked the grounds in the gathering darkness, getting a feel for the place that would be his home for however long he lasted. The ranch was bigger than he'd initially thought, with good water and decent grazing land. The buildings were solid, if in need of repair. The bones of a successful operation were all there, waiting for someone with the knowledge and determination to put them back together. As he made his way back to the bunkhouse, Tom caught sight of a figure walking toward the distant hills. Eleanor, dressed in her black shawl, moving with purpose through the moonlight. He watched until she disappeared into the shadows, wondering what drew her out into the night air when sensible people were settling down for sleep. Back in the bunkhouse, he lay on his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and cattle lowed softly in the pastures. It was peaceful in a way Tom had almost forgotten existed. His hand found the silver dollar in his pocket, and he rolled it between his fingers as he thought about the woman who'd hired him. Eleanor St. Prebla 0by.com. James was carrying a burden that went deeper than simple ranch management. He'd seen it in her eyes, the way she held herself, the careful control that threatened to crack at any moment. Tomorrow he'd start earning his keep, but tonight, for the first time in months, Tom Avery felt like he might have found a place where he could be useful again. Whether that place would prove to be his salvation or his downfall remained to be seen. Tom's first week at Black Hollow Ranch passed in a blur of mending fences and learning the rhythms of a place that had once hummed with purpose. The work was familiar, comforting, even the kind of honest labor that left a man tired in his bones but satisfied in his soul. Eleanor maintained her distance, appearing at meals and giving brief instructions before retreating to whatever occupied her time in the big house. It was Pete who filled in the gaps, explaining which pastures needed attention and where the best water sources could be found. The old cowhand worked with the careful movements of someone whose body had absorbed decades of hard living, but his mind remained sharp as a steel trap. "She's been different since the fire," Pete said one afternoon as they repaired a section of fence that had been knocked down by wandering cattle. "Used to laugh, you know. Had a way of making everyone around her feel like they mattered." Tom drove another nail into the fence post, considering his words. "Fire does that to people, changes them in ways that don't heal easy." "You talk like a man who knows." Tom's hammer paused mid-swing. "We all got our stories, Pete." That evening, Tom found himself unable to sleep. The bunkhouse felt too quiet, too empty, and his mind kept wandering to memories he'd rather leave buried. He pulled on his boots and stepped out into the cool night air, thinking a walk might settle his restless thoughts. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the ranch yard and the hills beyond. Tom had always been drawn to night hours. They reminded him of patrol duties and quiet conversations around dying campfires. As he walked, he noticed movement in the distance, a dark figure making its way across the landscape with deliberate steps. Eleanor. Tom hesitated, torn between respecting her privacy and his growing concern for her well-being. A woman walking alone at night in this country was asking for trouble, even on her own land. Mountain lions and wolves still roamed these hills, not to mention the two-legged predators that sometimes drifted through. He followed at a distance, careful to stay in the shadows. Eleanor moved with surprising confidence through the darkness, following what appeared to be a well-worn path that led toward a grove of blackened trees. As they drew closer, Tom understood where she was going. The ruins of a cabin sat in a small clearing, its chimney still standing like a monument to whatever had happened here. The walls had burned down to their stone foundations, leaving only scattered timbers and the skeletal remains of what had once been someone's home. Wildflowers had grown up through the debris, softening the harsh edges of destruction, but not erasing them. Eleanor walked to the center of the ruins and sank to her knees beside what might have been a doorway. From his hiding place behind a stand of pine trees, Tom could hear her voice, though not her words. She was talking to someone, or something, in tones that carried the weight of a conversation repeated many times before. Then the talking stopped, and the crying began. It started as a soft whimpering, the sound of someone trying to hold back grief that had grown too large to contain. But as the minutes passed, Eleanor's control cracked completely. Her sobs echoed across the clearing, raw and broken, the sound of a woman who had been carrying pain too heavy for one person to bear. Tom felt like an intruder, witnessing something private and sacred, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He'd heard grief before on battlefields and in hospital tents, in the letters that came from home with news that shattered young men's hearts. But this was different. This was grief that had been allowed to fester, growing stronger instead of healing. Eleanor's voice rose above her tears, and now Tom could make out words. "I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. Couldn't save either of you." Her hands reached out to touch something in the ashes, perhaps the memory of where a bed had stood or toys had been scattered. "I keep trying to make the ranch work like you would have wanted, but I don't know how to do it alone. I don't know how to be strong enough for both of us." Tom's chest tightened, James, her husband, and the boy Pete had mentioned. The fire had taken them both. Eleanor's sobbing gradually subsided into the exhausted quiet of someone who had emptied themselves of tears, at least for tonight. She remained kneeling in the ruins for a long time, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with the effort of breathing. Finally, she stood and turned to go. Tom retreated deeper into the shadows, giving her time to make her way back before he emerged from his hiding place. But as Eleanor passed near his position, she stopped suddenly. "I know you're there," she said quietly. "You might as well come out." Tom stepped into the moonlight, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Ma'am, I didn't mean to intrude. I was worried about you walking alone at night." Eleanor studied his face in the silver light. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was no shame in her expression, only a weary acceptance. "How much did you hear?" "Enough to understand why this place feels the way it does," Tom replied honestly. "I'm sorry for your loss." 3 years, Eleanor said, as if that explained everything. 3 years since the fire, and I still come here every night, hoping I'll figure out how to let them go. Maybe you're not supposed to let them go. Maybe you're just supposed to learn how to carry them different. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "You speak like a man who's carried his share of ghosts." Tom was quiet for a moment, remembering other fires, other losses. "We all got our dead, ma'am. Question is whether we let them guide us or drag us down." They walked back toward the ranch house in comfortable silence, Eleanor setting a pace that suggested she was in no hurry to end the conversation. The night air carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle settling into sleep. "James built that cabin when we were first married," Eleanor said as they reached the porch steps. "Said he wanted to start small, prove he could make a go of ranching before he asked my father for help expanding. Billy Sonny was born in that cabin, took his first steps on those floorboards." "What happened?" Eleanor's hand went to the chain at her throat, and Tom caught a glimpse of what hung there, a simple gold wedding ring, worn thin by years of wear. "Chimney fire in the middle of winter." James went back in for Billy, but the roof came down before he could get out. "I tried to follow them, but the heat—" She touched her left hand, and Tom noticed for the first time the faint scars that traced across her fingers. "I couldn't reach them." The weight of that guilt settled between them like a living thing. Tom had seen it before, the burden that survivors carried when they couldn't save the people who mattered most. He'd carried it himself. "You know it wasn't your fault," he said gently. "Knowing something and feeling it are two different things, Mr. Avery. I built that ranch house after the fire, made it grand enough for the family James and I had planned to have. But it's just a monument to what I lost, not a home for what I might still find." Eleanor climbed the porch steps slowly, like a woman older than her years. At the door, she paused and looked back at Tom. "Thank you for staying," she said. "The other hands, when they saw me like this, they couldn't get away fast enough. Made them uncomfortable, I suppose, seeing a woman grieve. Grief isn't something to be ashamed of, ma'am. It just means you loved something worth mourning." Eleanor's smile was small but genuine. "Perhaps that's why you're still here, and they're not. Good night, Mr. Avery." As Tom made his way back to the bunkhouse, he understood something that had been puzzling him since his arrival. The ranch wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by love that had nowhere to go. Eleanor sent. James wasn't crazy or cursed. She was a woman trapped by her own devotion to the dead, unable to see a path forward that didn't feel like betrayal. For the first time since taking the job, Tom began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he'd found a place where his own particular set of wounds might actually be useful. He'd learned something about carrying the dead, about the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. If Eleanor would let him, perhaps he could help her learn the difference between honoring the past and being buried by it. The question was whether either of them was brave enough to try. The morning after Tom's midnight encounter with Eleanor brought a subtle shift to the ranch's atmosphere. Eleanor still maintained her formal distance, but there was less frost in her voice when she gave instructions, and occasionally Tom caught her watching him work with something that might have been curiosity. Tom threw himself into the ranch work with the intensity of a man who had found purpose again. The physical labor felt good after months of aimless drifting, and there was satisfaction in seeing immediate results from his efforts. Fences that had been falling down for months were suddenly straight and strong. Gates that had hung crooked now swung true. The machinery in the barn, neglected and rusting, began to hum with efficiency under his patient attention. It was while repairing the water pump that served the main pasture that Tom's military training truly showed itself. The pump had been acting up for weeks, according to Pete, delivering water in fits and starts that left the cattle restless and the grass brown in patches. "I've tried everything I can think of," Pete said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Might be time to call in a specialist from town, though Lord knows what that'll cost." Tom studied the pump mechanism with the methodical approach he'd once applied to field equipment that meant the difference between life and death for his men. The Congressional Medal of Honor tucked away in his saddlebags had been earned partly through his ability to keep critical equipment running under impossible conditions. A ranch water pump was child's play compared to maintaining artillery in the middle of a Dakota blizzard. "Hand me that wrench," Tom said, his voice taking on the quiet authority that had once commanded respect from enlisted men and officers alike. "The problem's not mechanical, it's the intake valve. Someone installed it backward." Within an hour, water was flowing steadily again, and Pete was looking at Tom with new respect. "Where'd you learn to fix things like that?" "Army teaches you to make do with what you have," Tom replied, deliberately vague. "When you're 100 miles from the nearest town, you learn to fix things yourself or do without." But the truth was more complicated than that. Tom's service record, if anyone had bothered to look, would have shown commendations for technical innovation under fire, leadership citations, and recommendations for promotion that had never come. What it wouldn't show was the reason those promotions had been denied, or why a decorated officer had ended his career with a court-martial and a dishonorable discharge. That evening, as Tom sat on the bunkhouse porch, cleaning his rifly habit that died hard in old soldiers, Eleanor approached with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested she'd been working up the courage for this conversation. "Pete tells me you have the pump working better than it has in years," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "Just needed someone to look at it fresh," Tom replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Sometimes the problem's not what it appears to be." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, studying the way Tom's hands moved over the rifle with practiced efficiency. "You carry yourself like an officer, not an enlisted man. I've seen enough military men to know the difference." Tom's hands stilled on the rifle stock. "What makes you think I was, either? The way you assess a situation before acting, how you fix that pump, you saw the whole system, not just the broken part. That's how leaders think." Eleanor's grey eyes were sharp in the lamplight. "Also, that medal you keep wrapped in cloth in your saddlebags. Sarah mentioned it when she was cleaning." Tom set down his coffee cup carefully. "Sarah shouldn't be going through my things. Sarah's been looking after this family for 20 years. She notices things." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "I'm not prying for the sake of gossip, Mr. Avery. I need to know who I'm trusting with my ranch." The directness of her approach reminded Tom of his commanding officer, a man who'd valued honesty above politeness. He could lie, deflect, or change the subject. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. "I was a major in the 7th Cavalry," he said quietly. "Served 12 years, mostly in the Dakota Territory. Got commended for technical innovation and troop leadership." He paused, his fingers finding the groove in the rifle stock where countless cleanings had worn the wood smooth. Also got court-martialed for disobeying direct orders. Eleanor waited, understanding that the real story lay in what he wasn't saying. "We were ordered to attack a Lakota village," Tom continued, his voice growing quieter. "Intelligence said it was a war party staging ground. When we got there, it was mostly women, children, and old men. I called off the attack." "That sounds like the right decision." "My commanding officer disagreed, said orders were orders, and it wasn't my place to make tactical decisions based on sentiment." Tom's jaw tightened at the memory. "So I was given a direct order to proceed with the attack. When I refused again, half my men backed me up. The other half followed orders." Eleanor could see where this was heading. There was fighting between American soldiers over whether to slaughter civilians. Tom's voice carried the weight of old shame. "3 good men died because I couldn't find a way to save those villagers without splitting my command. In the end, the village was spared, but my career was over. Dishonorable discharge for insubordination and causing discord in the ranks." "And the medal?" Tom almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Awarded 6 months before the court-martial for defending a civilian settlement against raiders. Ironic, considering what ended my career." Eleanor was quiet for a long time, processing this information. "Do you regret it? Refusing the order?" "Not for a second. I regret how I handled it. Regret that good men died because of my mistakes. But I don't regret choosing conscience over orders." Tom met her eyes steadily. "If that makes me unfit for this job, I understand." Instead of dismissing him, Eleanor surprised Tom by smiling the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since arriving at Black Hollow. "Mr. Avery, in the past month I've had 3 ranch hands quit after a week, 2 steal equipment before disappearing in the night, and one who tried to convince me to sell the ranch to his business associates in Denver. You've worked harder in 7 days than the rest of them combined, fixed things that have been broken for months, and just proved you're willing to sacrifice your own interests to protect people who can't protect themselves." She stood, gathering the coffee cups. "I'm not looking for a perfect man, Tom. I'm looking for a good one." As Eleanor walked back toward the house, Tom felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried for so long it had become part of his identity. For 3 years, he'd been drifting from job to job, carrying his shame like a physical weight. But Eleanor St. James had looked at his deepest failure and seen not weakness, but the kind of strength she needed. Maybe Pete was right, and this place was different since the fire. But maybe different didn't necessarily mean broken. Maybe sometimes it just meant ready for something new. Tom finished cleaning his rifle and settled back in his chair, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine staying somewhere long enough to see the seasons change, to watch projects he'd started come to completion. The silver dollar in his pocket felt heavier tonight, not with desperation, but with possibility. The next morning brought visitors to Black Hollow Ranch, the kind that arrived in expensive carriages with city dust on their wheels and intentions that weren't entirely honest. Tom was replacing boards on the barn door when he heard the sound of approaching horses and looked up to see 3 men in dark suits making their way up the ranch road. Eleanor emerged from the house before they reached the porch, her posture straight and unwelcoming. She'd changed from her work clothes into a formal dress that emphasized her role as mistress of the ranch, and she carried herself with the authority her father had taught her. "Mrs. St. James," the lead man called out as he dismounted. He was tall and thin, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his time in offices rather than outdoors. "I'm Richard Holbrook from Mountain Development Company. We've been corresponding." "Mr. Holbrook," Eleanor's voice could have frozen water in July. "I thought I made our position clear in my last letter." Tom continued working on the barn door, but positioned himself where he could hear the conversation. Pete appeared from the machinery shed, ostensibly checking on equipment, but clearly keeping an eye on the proceedings. "Now, Mrs. St. James, I understand your attachment to this place," Holbrook said with the practiced patience of a man accustomed to dealing with what he considered unreasonable women. But surely you can see the wisdom in our offer. 3 times what this land is worth for agricultural purposes, and you'd be free to relocate somewhere more suitable for a woman in your circumstances." "My circumstances," Eleanor repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "You mean being a widow?" "I mean being alone and trying to manage an operation that requires more resources than you currently possess." Holbrook gestured toward the ranch buildings. "This place is falling apart, Mrs. St. James. How many cattle did you lose last winter? How many hands have you been through this year?" Tom saw Eleanor's hands clench at her sides, but her voice remained controlled. "My ranch's condition is not your concern, Mr. Holbrook. But it is, you see. The Mountain Development Company has plans for this entire valley. A resort community for wealthy Eastern families seeking the Western experience. Your ranch sits right in the center of our proposed development. We're prepared to be generous, but we do need your cooperation." "And if I don't cooperate?" One of Holbrook's companions, a heavy-set man with scarred knuckles, stepped forward slightly. "Well, ma'am, sometimes the territory can be dangerous for folks who don't have proper protection. Cattle get stolen, buildings catch fire, accidents happen." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Tom felt his military training kick in, his hands stilled on the barn door, and his attention focused completely on the 3 men. Without conscious thought, he began calculating distances, cover positions, and tactical advantages. Eleanor, however, stepped forward rather than back. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Holbrook?" "Not at all," Holbrook said smoothly. "Simply pointing out the realities of ranch life. Perhaps you'd like some time to consider our offer. We'll be in town for a few days." The men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Eleanor standing on the porch with her fists clenched and her jaw set in lines that reminded Tom of her father's portrait in the parlor. "Ma'am," Tom said, approaching the porch. "You all right?" "Vultures," Eleanor said bitterly. "They've been circling for months, ever since word got out about our difficulties. They think a woman alone is easy prey." "What kind of development are they planning?" Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A playground for rich Easterners who want to pretend they're cowboys for a few weeks each summer. They'd tear down everything my father built, turn this into some kind of dude ranch where soft-handed city folk can play at being Westerners." Tom understood her anger, but he also recognized the practical realities she was facing. "How much debt is the ranch carrying?" Eleanor's gray eyes flashed with pride and pain. "Enough that their offer would solve my financial problems and leave me with money to spare. But it would also mean abandoning everything my family worked for." "Your father built this place from nothing?" "From less than nothing." Eleanor walked to the porch railing and looked out over the ranch lands. "He came west after the war with a dream and enough determination to make it real. Started with 100 head of cattle and a piece of land that nobody else wanted. Spent 30 years turning it into something that mattered." She went into the house and returned a few minutes later with an old Winchester rifle, its stock polished smooth by decades of use and its metal gleaming with careful maintenance. "This was his," she said, running her fingers along the barrel. "He always said a person's worth wasn't measured by what they inherited, but by what they built with their own hands. This ranch represents 3 generations of St. James' sweat and sacrifice." Tom examined the rifle with the appreciation of someone who understood quality craftsmanship. "It's a fine weapon, well cared for. He taught me to shoot with this rifle. Said a woman in this country needed to be able to protect what was hers." Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I may be alone, Mr. Avery, but I'm not helpless. And I'm not selling to developers who see my family's legacy as nothing more than an inconvenience to be bought off." The conviction in her voice stirred something in Tom that had been dormant for too long. Here was someone fighting for something that mattered, someone who understood the difference between what was easy and what was right. "What can I do to help?" he asked. Eleanor looked at him with surprise, as if she'd forgotten that she wasn't facing this alone anymore. "You're willing to stay, even knowing there might be trouble?" "Ma'am, I've been running from trouble for 3 years. Maybe it's time I stood and faced it instead." A smile tugged at the corners of Eleanor's mouth, the first time Tom had seen her look genuinely happy since his arrival. "Well then, Tom Avery, I suppose we'd better figure out how to make this ranch profitable enough that Mr. Holbrook and his friends lose interest in our land." As they talked about cattle numbers and market prices, about repairs that needed prioritizing and expenses that could be postponed, Tom felt the familiar satisfaction of planning a campaign. It had been too long since he'd had something worth fighting for, something that required the kind of strategic thinking that had once made him a decorated officer. The silver dollar in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding him of his father's words about sacrifice and what was right. Maybe this was why he'd ended up at Black Hollow Ranch, not just to find work, but to find a cause worthy of the man he'd once been. 3 weeks after Holbrook's visit, Tom was in Eleanor's study, helping her review the ranch's financial records, when they made a discovery that changed everything. The study itself was a testament to the St. James family's history. Leather-bound books lined the walls, maps of the territory showed the ranch's evolution over decades, and her father's old cavalry sword hung above the fireplace. Eleanor had spread the legal documents across her father's massive oak desk, papers that chronicled the ranch's ownership back to the original land grant. Tom's military experience had included enough legal matters to give him a practical understanding of property law, and something about the mineral rights clause in the original deed caught his attention. "This is unusual," Tom said, pointing to a section of dense legal text. "Most territorial land grants excluded mineral rights, but this one seems to include them." Eleanor leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his as she examined the document. The contact was brief but electric, and Tom found himself acutely aware of her presence, the lavender scent of her soap, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the soft sound of her breathing. "I never paid much attention to that clause," Eleanor admitted. "Father always said we were cattle ranchers, not miners. But you're right, it does seem to grant complete mineral rights to the property owner." Tom studied the document more carefully, his finger tracing the elaborate legal language. "According to this, your family owns everything above and below ground for the entire ranch. That's more than 20,000 acres. Why would that matter? There's never been any mining in this valley." "Maybe not yet." Tom sat back in his chair, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind. "But think about why Holbrook's so interested in this specific piece of land. A resort could be built anywhere in the territory, with good views and water access. Why does it have to be here?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "You think they know something we don't?" "I think we need to find out what kind of geological survey work has been done in this area recently." Tom gathered the documents carefully. "Would your father's lawyer have kept records of any mining claims or survey requests?" Samuel Morrison, Pete's older brother. He handled father's legal affairs for 30 years. If anyone would know, it's him. The next morning, Eleanor and Tom rode into Bitter Creek together, ostensibly to buy supplies, but actually to visit the lawyer's office above the bank. Samuel Morrison was a thin, precise man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful manner of someone who'd spent his life dealing with other people's secrets. "Eleanor, good to see you," Morrison said, rising from behind a desk covered with neat stacks of papers. "And you must be the new ranch hand everyone's talking about." Tom shook the lawyer's hand, noting the strength in the older man's grip. "Tom Avery, pleased to meet you." "Samuel, we need to ask you about mineral rights on the ranch," Eleanor said without preamble, "and whether anyone's been making inquiries about geological surveys in our area." Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. "Interesting you should ask. I've had 3 different parties contact me in the past 6 months about mineral rights in the valley, all claiming to represent different companies, but the paperwork was remarkably similar." "What kind of minerals were they asking about?" Tom asked. "Copper, primarily, though there were mentions of silver and even some rare earth elements." Morrison pulled a file from his cabinet. "I turned them all down, of course, since your family owns the mineral rights outright. But I did some research afterward, just to satisfy my curiosity." The lawyer spread out a territorial geological survey map, pointing to areas marked with different symbols. According to this survey from last year, there's a significant copper deposit running right through your ranch, possibly one of the largest untapped deposits in the territory. Eleanor stared at the map, understanding flooding her face. That's why Holbrook wants the land. It's not about building a resort, it's about the minerals. A copper mine would be worth hundreds of times what they've offered you for the ranch, Morrison confirmed. If this survey is accurate, we're talking about enough copper to supply railroad construction for the next decade. Tom studied the map more carefully, his tactical mind already working through the implications. How many people know about this survey? It's a territorial document, so it's public record, but most folks don't know how to read geological surveys, and the Territorial Office doesn't exactly advertise their findings. But companies like Mountain Development would know how to access and interpret this information, Eleanor said grimly. Without question, and if they can acquire your land through purchase or legal pressure, they'd own one of the most valuable mineral deposits in the territory for a fraction of its true worth. Tom and Eleanor exchanged glances, both understanding that the stakes had just increased dramatically. This wasn't simply about preserving a family ranch, it was about protecting what could be the foundation of Eleanor's financial independence for decades to come. What are our options? Eleanor asked. Morrison leaned back in his chair, considering. Legally, your position is strong. You own the mineral rights, and the original deed is clear and unambiguous. But legal strength doesn't always translate to practical security, especially when significant money is involved. You mean they might try other methods of persuasion? Tom said quietly. I mean that accidents happen to people who stand in the way of large profits. Mining companies have been known to play rough when legal methods don't produce results. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Both Tom and Eleanor lost in thought about what they'd learned. The landscape looked different now, not just good grazing land, but something valuable enough that men might kill to possess it. I need to ask you something, Eleanor said as they approached the ranch gates. Knowing what we know now, are you still willing to stay? This could get dangerous. Tom reined in his horse and looked at her seriously. Eleanor, I've spent 3 years running from fights I should have finished. I'm tired of running. The use of her first name hung in the air between them, an intimacy that neither acknowledged, but both felt. Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't correct him. Besides, Tom continued, your father didn't build this ranch just to hand it over to the first group of bullies who came calling. If there's copper under this land, it belongs to you, not to some development company from back east. Eleanor's smile was radiant. Then I suppose we'd better figure out how to protect what's ours. As they rode through the gates of Black Hollow Ranch, Tom felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, not just for the ranch's daily operations, but for Eleanor's safety and future. It was a feeling he'd thought he'd lost forever when his military career ended in disgrace. The silver dollar in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, as if his father were reminding him that sometimes a man's true worth was measured not by his past failures, but by his willingness to stand for what was right when it mattered most. The attack started small fence cuts that let cattle wander onto neighboring properties, broken water lines that required expensive repairs, and feed that mysteriously spoiled overnight. Tom recognized the pattern from his military days. Psychological warfare designed to wear down an opponent's resolve before the real assault began. Eleanor handled each setback with grim determination, but Tom could see the toll it was taking. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and her hand went more frequently to the locket she wore beneath her dress, the one Pete had mentioned, containing pictures of her husband and son. It was on a particularly difficult morning, after they'd spent 3 hours rounding up cattle that had escaped through yet another cut fence, that Eleanor finally reached her breaking point. Maybe I should just sell, she said quietly as they rode back toward the ranch house. Maybe fighting this is just pride talking, and I'm putting everyone at risk for nothing. Tom reined in his horse, forcing Eleanor to stop as well. Is that what you really believe? I believe I'm tired of watching everything my father built fall apart piece by piece. I believe those men will keep escalating until someone gets hurt, and I believe, her voice broke slightly, I believe James and Billy would rather see me safe and settled somewhere else than dead defending a piece of land. Tom dismounted and walked to Eleanor's horse, reaching up to help her down. When her feet touched the ground, she was standing close enough that he could see the unshed tears in her grey eyes. "Eleanor," he said gently, "what do you think your husband would say if he could see you right now?" "He'd say I was being stubborn and foolish, probably." A tear spilled over, tracing a path down her cheek. "No," Tom's voice was certain. "He'd say you were being brave. He'd say you were fighting for something that mattered, and he'd be proud of you for not giving up." Eleanor looked up at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. "How can you know that?" "Because I know what it looks like when someone loves something bigger than themselves. Your husband built that cabin with his own hands, started this ranch with nothing but determination and hope. He wouldn't want you to surrender what he died protecting." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying Tom's face. "You speak as if you knew him." "I knew men like him. Good men who understood that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible." Tom's hand reached up, almost without conscious thought, to brush the tear from her cheek. "You're not fighting for a piece of land, Eleanor. You're fighting for the idea that people like your father and husband can build something lasting, something that can't be bought or stolen by men with more money than honor." The touch of his calloused fingers against her skin sent warmth through Eleanor that she hadn't felt in 3 years. For a moment, the weight of grief and responsibility lifted, replaced by something she'd thought was gone, forever the feeling of being understood, of being seen as more than just a problem to be solved. "Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind through the grass. They stood there in the morning sunlight, the space between them charged with possibility and the shared recognition that something was changing between them. Tom's hand lingered against her cheek, and Eleanor's eyes searched his face for the answer to questions she wasn't ready to ask aloud. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Tom stepped back quickly, and Eleanor smoothed her skirts as Pete appeared over a rise, riding hard with urgency written across his weathered features. "Boss," Pete called out as he approached, "we got trouble, real trouble this time." "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her composure restored but her cheeks still flushed. "Found 3 head dead in the north pasture, shot, not sick, and there's something else." Pete's expression was grim. "Found tracks leading away from the scene. 5 or 6 men on horseback, heading toward the territorial road." Tom's jaw tightened. Killing cattle was a serious escalation, the kind of message that couldn't be misunderstood. "How long ago?" "Hour, maybe 2. Tracks are still fresh." Eleanor's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady. "We need to report this to the sheriff." "Sheriff's out of town," Pete said grimly. "Won't be back for 3 days, and even if he was here, ain't much he could do without catching them in the act." Tom was already moving toward his horse. "I'm going to follow those tracks, see where they lead." "I'm coming with you," Eleanor said immediately. "No." Tom's voice carried the authority of his military training. "If this is an ambush, I need to know you're safe. Stay here with Pete, and if we're not back by sunset, ride to town and wire the territorial marshal." Eleanor started to protest, but something in Tom's expression stopped her. This was the man who'd once led cavalry charges and defended civilian settlements, and she could see the tactical mind at work behind his eyes. "Be careful," she said instead, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. Tom covered her hand with his own, the gesture brief but meaningful. "I will, but Eleanor, promise me you won't let this scare you into giving up. What happened here today just proves how valuable this land really is." As Tom rode north following the tracks, Eleanor watched until he disappeared over the ridge. The warmth of his touch lingered on her arm, and for the first time since James's death, she found herself genuinely afraid of losing someone again. Pete observed her expression with the knowing look of someone who'd watched Eleanor grow from a young bride into a strong woman. "He's a good man, that one. Knows how to fight, but more important, knows what's worth fighting for." Eleanor touched the locket at her throat, feeling the familiar weight of James's and Billy's pictures through the fabric of her dress. For 3 years, she'd worn it as a reminder of what she'd lost. But standing here watching Tom ride into danger on her behalf, she began to wonder if it might also be a reminder that love, once found, was worth the risk of losing it again. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think he does." The afternoon stretched long as Eleanor and Pete waited for Tom's return, both of them finding excuses to check the northern horizon every few minutes. The silence of the ranch felt different, now not peaceful, but expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks. Eleanor found herself praying to a God she'd been angry with for 3 years, asking not for James and Billy to be returned to her, but for Tom to come home safe. The shift in her prayers felt like the first step toward a future she was finally ready to consider. Tom returned just as the sun was setting, his face grim with what he'd discovered. The tracks had led to a camp 5 miles north of the ranch, where he'd found evidence of a larger operation than any of them had suspected. But it wasn't the dead cattle or the threatening camp that weighed most heavily on his mind as he approached the ranch house. Eleanor met him on the porch, relief evident in her face. "Thank God you're safe. What did you find?" "More than we bargained for," Tom said, dismounting slowly. "There's at least a dozen men camped up there, and they're not just hired guns. This is a military-style operation." Pete emerged from the barn, having heard Tom's arrival. "Military? Coordinated watches, organized supply lines, proper field discipline. Someone with real training is running this show." Tom's expression darkened. "But that's not the worst of it." Eleanor and Pete exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" Tom reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded document he'd found at the camp. "They're not just trying to scare you into selling, Eleanor. They have forged deeds claiming ownership of your mineral rights. If they can create enough chaos and violence, they plan to have you declared incompetent to manage the property and petition the territorial court to award custody to a responsible party, namely Mountain Development Company." "They can't do that," Eleanor said, but her voice lacked conviction. "They can if they have the right judge bought and paid for, and if something were to happen to you during all this chaos." Tom left the sentence unfinished. The implications hung heavy in the evening air. This wasn't just about business anymore, it was about Eleanor's life. "There's something else," Tom said quietly. "I recognized one of the men in that camp, Captain Marcus Webb, my former commanding officer." Eleanor's face went pale. "The one who ordered the attack on the village?" "The same, which means this isn't just about the copper mine. Someone's gone to considerable trouble to bring Webb here specifically." Tom's jaw tightened. "They know about my past, Eleanor. They know exactly who I am and why I was court-martialed." Pete stepped forward, his weathered face concerned. "What does that mean for us?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old shame and present fear. "It means they have leverage against me. Webb's been telling his version of what happened in Dakota for years, the version where I was a coward who got good men killed because I was too weak to follow orders. If this goes to court, he'll testify that I'm unreliable, dangerous, a man who cracks under pressure." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Tom, what really happened in Dakota?" Tom closed his eyes, the memories as vivid as if they'd happened yesterday. "We'd been tracking a war party for 3 days, following reports of raids on isolated settlements. When we finally caught up to them, it wasn't what we expected." He paused, gathering the courage to tell the whole truth for the first time in years. "The village was mostly women, children, and elderly men. The warriors were out hunting, according to the women who tried to talk to us. But Webb had his orders from Territorial Command. Any Indian encampment in the area was to be considered hostile." Eleanor and Pete listened in silence as Tom continued. "I tried to explain that these weren't the raiders we were looking for, asked for time to verify the situation. Webb said orders were orders, and that it wasn't my place to make strategic decisions based on what he called savage lies." Tom's hands clenched as the memory intensified. "So, I refused to order the attack. Half my men agreed with me they could see what I saw. The other half followed Webb's direct order to charge the village." "What happened?" The men who followed me formed a defensive line to protect the civilians. The men who followed Webb charged into the village. Fighting broke out between the two groups, American soldiers shooting at each other, while Lakota women and children ran for their lives. Tom's voice broke slightly. 3 of my men died trying to protect those civilians, good men who trusted my judgment and paid for it with their lives. In the end, the village was spared, but Webb reported the incident as mutiny, said I'd been compromised by enemy influence and was unfit for command. Eleanor stepped closer to Tom, her anger evident. But you saved innocent lives. I got my own men killed, Eleanor. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the situation, 3 soldiers died because I couldn't find a way to resolve the conflict without violence. Tom finally met her eyes. Webb was right about one thing I did, crack under pressure. Maybe not the way he claimed, but I failed as a leader when my men needed me most. The silence stretched between them until Eleanor spoke, her voice firm with conviction. You didn't fail, Tom. You chose conscience over convenience, and you paid a price for doing what was right. Those men who died with you, they made their own choice to protect civilians. That's not failure, that's honor. Webb won't see it that way. And neither will a territorial judge who's being paid to see things Mountain Development's way. Tom's shoulders sagged with the weight of old guilt and present fear. If this goes to court, I'll be painted as an unreliable coward who brings death and chaos wherever he goes. They'll use my past to discredit anything I say in your defense. Pete had been quiet throughout Tom's revelation, but now he spoke with the wisdom of a man who'd seen enough of life to understand its complexities. Tom, I've watched you work for weeks now. Seen how you handle problems, how you treat people, how you carry yourself. Whatever happened in Dakota, the man standing here now is someone I'd trust with my life. Eleanor nodded emphatically. Pete's right. I don't care what Webb says about your past. I care about who you are now, and the man I've come to know would never abandon someone who needed help. But even as Eleanor spoke, Tom could see doubt creeping into her eyes, not doubt about his character, but fear about what his presence might mean for her chances of keeping the ranch. If his past could be used against her in court, then staying might be the most selfish thing he could do. Eleanor, he said quietly, maybe I should leave. Find somewhere else to go before this gets worse. If I'm not here, they can't use my history against you. No. Eleanor's response was immediate and fierce. I won't let them drive you away with threats and lies. We'll face this together, whatever comes. But as Tom looked at her determined face in the gathering darkness, he wondered if staying was an act of courage or selfishness. He'd already brought death to men who'd trusted him once before. Could he live with himself if his presence brought harm to Eleanor as well? The weight of his father's silver dollar felt heavier than ever in his pocket, a reminder of principles that seemed increasingly difficult to uphold when the stakes involved someone else's life and future. For 3 days after Tom's revelation, a tense quiet settled over Black Hollow Ranch. Eleanor threw herself into ranch work with desperate intensity, as if staying busy could postpone the inevitable confrontation. Tom worked alongside her, but she could sense his growing internal struggle, the way he'd pause in his work to stare toward the northern hills, the careful way he avoided being alone with her, the guilt that shadowed his eyes whenever their conversation touched on the future. It was Pete who broke the standoff, approaching Eleanor on the 4th morning with a telegram that had arrived in town. This came for Tom, Pete said, holding out the yellow paper. Telegraph operator said it was marked urgent. Eleanor found Tom in the barn, methodically cleaning and oiling every piece of equipment, as if preparing for a siege. When she handed him the telegram, his face went pale as he read it. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. Tom handed her the telegram without speaking. The message was brief but devastating. Regret to inform, stop Captain Marcus Webb spreading false testimony regarding Major Thomas Avery. Stop claiming Avery responsible for deaths of Sergeant Collins, Corporal Martinez, Private Henley. Stop survivors of Dakota incident. Dispute Webb's account. Stop signed. Colonel James Morrison, commanding officer, 7th Cavalry. Stop. Eleanor read the telegram twice, her anger building with each word. This Colonel Morrison, he was there? He was Webb's superior, arrived just after the fighting stopped. Tom's voice was hollow with old pain. He's the one who ordered the court-martial, but he also filed a minority report defending my actions, said the situation was impossible and that any officer would have faced the same dilemma. Then why didn't you tell me about this report? Tom was quiet for a long moment, organizing his thoughts. Because it didn't matter. 3 men still died under my command, and I've been carrying that weight for 3 years. Morrison's report was buried in military archivesset, never changed anything for me. Eleanor felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. It matters now. If Webb is spreading lies about what happened, we need the truth to come out. Eleanor, you don't understand how this works. Military politics, territorial courts, they're not interested in truth when money and power are involved. Webb's version of events will be simpler, cleaner, easier for a judge to understand and accept. But Eleanor was already moving, her mind racing with possibilities. We need to wire Colonel Morrison. Get him to come here and testify to what really happened. He won't come. A colonel doesn't travel hundreds of miles to defend a disgraced major. Eleanor stopped pacing and looked at Tom with the same determined expression she'd worn when facing down Holbrook's threats. Then we'll make him understand why it matters. Not just for you, but for what's right. That evening, Eleanor composed a telegram to Colonel Morrison that was both a plea and a challenge. Colonel Morrison, stop. Major Avery being used as pawn in corrupt land. Grab. Stop. False testimony by Captain Webb. Threatens innocent lives. Stop truth about Dakota. Incident crucial to preventing injustice. Stop. Request your immediate assistance. Stop. Eleanor St. James, Black Hollow Ranch, Bitter Creek Territory. Stop. While they waited for a response, Tom found himself dealing with an unexpected problem, the growing feelings between him and Eleanor, that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge openly. The stress of their situation had intensified everything, and stolen moments of connection were becoming harder to ignore. It happened during their evening walks, when Eleanor insisted on checking the ranch perimeter, despite Tom's concerns about safety. She'd started wearing her father's pistol on these walks, and the sight of her determined profile in the moonlight reminded Tom of everything he was fighting to protect. You know, Eleanor said one evening as they paused by the creek that marked the ranch's eastern boundary, 3 months ago I was ready to give up on everything. The ranch, the future, even the idea that life held anything good anymore. Tom watched the moonlight play across the water, hyper-aware of Eleanor's presence beside him. What changed? You did. Eleanor's voice was soft but certain. You showed me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. More than that, you reminded me that I'm worth fighting for. Tom felt his resolve wavering. Every instinct told him to reach for her, to speak the words that had been building in his heart for weeks. Instead, he stepped back, creating distance between them. Eleanor, we can't, not while all this is unresolved. If something happens to you because of me. Nothing is going to happen to me, Eleanor said firmly, and even if it did, that would be my choice to make, not yours. Before Tom could respond, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. A single rider was approaching fast, and Tom's hand went instinctively to his gun until he recognized Pete's silhouette. Eleanor, Tom, Pete called out as he reached them. Got news from town. The telegraph operator's been working late. There's a response from that colonel. They rode back to the ranch house quickly, where Pete handed Eleanor a telegram that was longer than most official correspondence. Mrs. St. James, stop Major Avery among finest officers I have served, with stop Dakota incident, result of impossible situation and corrupt orders. Stop Avery's actions, saved civilian lives at cost of military career. Stop Captain. Webb's current testimony contradicts official record. Stop departing immediately for Bitter Creek. Stop, expect arrival 3 days. Stop, Colonel James Morrison. Stop. Eleanor felt tears of relief and vindication spring to her eyes. He's coming, Tom. The truth is going to come out. But Tom's expression remained troubled. 3 days. Webb and his men won't wait that long if they know Morrison's coming. They'll move against us before he arrives." As if summoned by his words, the sound of multiple horses approached the ranch. Tom counted at least 6 riders, moving with the coordinated precision of a military patrol. He extinguished the lamp quickly and moved to the window. "It's Webb," he said grimly, "and he's not here for conversation." Eleanor checked her father's pistol and moved to join Tom at the window. In the moonlight, they could see the riders arranging themselves in a semicircle around the house, cutting off escape routes with tactical efficiency. "Tom, Avery," Webb's voice carried clearly across the yard. "I know you're in there. Time we finished what started in Dakota." Tom looked at Eleanor, his face etched with regret and determination. "I'm going out there. Whatever happens, stay inside until it's over." "No." Eleanor's grip on his arm was fierce. "We face this together." "Eleanor, this is my fight, my past, my mistakes." "Our future," Eleanor interrupted. "Whatever you did or didn't do in Dakota, you're here now, fighting for something that matters. That makes it my fight too." Tom saw the absolute conviction in her grey eyes and realized that arguing would be pointless. Eleanor St. James had made her choice, and like her father before her, she would stand and fight for what was hers. "All right," he said quietly. "But we do this smart. Webb's expecting me to come out alone, probably hoping to provoke me into doing something rash. Instead, we're going to surprise him." Tom's military mind was already working through tactical options. The house provided good cover, and he knew the ranch layout better than Webb's men. If they could hold out until dawn, there was a chance help might arrive from town. "What do you need me to do?" Eleanor asked. Tom looked at this remarkable woman who had chosen to stand with him despite the danger and felt something shift in his heart. The guilt and shame he'd carried for 3 years were still there, but they were balanced now by something stronger, the determination to be worthy of her faith in him. "I need you to trust me," he said, "and I need you to be ready for anything." Outside, Webb's voice rose again, more impatient this time. "Last chance, Avery. Come out and face justice, or we'll come in and get you." Tom checked his rifle one final time and moved toward the door. The silver dollar in his pocket felt warm against his leg, and for the first time in years, he understood what his father had meant about sacrifice and what was right. Some battles, he realized, were worth fighting regardless of the cost. Tom stepped onto the porch with his hands visible but ready, Eleanor beside him with her father's rifle held with practiced confidence. The sight of her standing there, unafraid and determined, seemed to surprise Webb and his men. "Captain Webb," Tom said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded respect from enlisted men and officers alike. "I see you're still following orders from men who pay better than the army." Webb sat his horse with military precision, but his face showed the wear of a man who'd spent years justifying choices that kept him awake at night. "Major Avery. Still hiding behind civilians, I see. The only one hiding here is you, Marcus. Hiding behind lies and bought testimony because the truth doesn't serve your new employers." Tom took a step forward, drawing Webb's attention away from Eleanor. "Tell me, how much is Mountain Development paying you to rewrite history?" "Enough to make it worth dealing with a coward who got good men killed." Webb's hand rested on his sidearm, but he hadn't drawn it yet. "Collins, Martinez, Henley, they died because you couldn't follow simple orders." Eleanor felt anger surge through her at the accusation, but Tom's voice remained steady. "They died protecting innocent people from an illegal attack, and you know it." "Illegal?" Webb laughed harshly. "Orders from territorial command are never illegal, Avery. That's something you never understood sometimes. Good soldiers have to do hard things. Good soldiers protect the innocent. They don't murder children because it's convenient." Tom's military bearing was evident now, the posture and presence that had once made him a natural leader. "You want to settle this, Marcus? Let's settle it. But leave Mrs. St. James out of it." Webb's eyes shifted to Eleanor, taking in her determined stance and the way she held her rifle. "The widow's made her choice, standing with you. She can live with the consequences." That was the moment Eleanor stepped forward, her voice cutting through the night air with quiet authority. "Captain Webb, you're trespassing on my land and threatening my family. I suggest you leave before I decide you're rustlers and treat you accordingly." One of Webb's men, a heavy-set gunfighter with scarred hands, spurred his horse forward. "Maybe the lady needs a lesson in manners." Tom's rifle was in his hands and aimed before the man could finish his sentence. "That's far enough." The standoff stretched tight, 6 armed men facing 2 defenders with the ranch house at their backs. Eleanor could feel the tension building toward violence, but she also sensed something else: uncertainty among Webb's men. They'd been hired to intimidate a widow and a broken-down cowhand, not to face a determined woman and a man who moved with the confidence of a born soldier. "You're outnumbered, Avery," Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Numbers don't mean much when you're fighting for something that matters," Tom replied. "Ask any of your men if they're ready to die for Mountain Development's profit margins." Webb's eyes narrowed as he realized his tactical advantage was slipping away. Tom wasn't the broken man he'd expected to find, and Eleanor wasn't the helpless widow his employers had described. More concerning, some of his hired guns were looking less enthusiastic about the confrontation. "Last chance," Webb said, drawing his sidearm. "Stand down, or we'll take the ranch by force." Eleanor raised her rifle, the moonlight gleaming off the barrel of her father's Winchester. "This ranch has been in my family for 30 years. My father built it with his own hands, defended it against raiders and rustlers, and anyone else who thought they could take what wasn't theirs." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, carrying the conviction of generations. "He taught me that some things are worth fighting for, and some principles can't be bought at any price. If you want this land, Captain Webb, you'll have to take it from us." Tom felt a surge of pride and affection watching Eleanor stand her ground. This was the woman who'd hidden her strength behind grief for too long, finally showing the steel that had attracted him from the beginning. "Stand with me, Eleanor," he said quietly, moving to position himself beside her. "Always," she replied, and the simple word carried the weight of a promise that went far beyond the immediate danger. Webb's face hardened as he realized that intimidation had failed. His employers wanted the ranch, and they weren't paying him to return empty-handed. "Have it your way, boys. Take the house." The night exploded into gunfire as Webb's men spurred their horses forward. Tom and Eleanor moved with coordinated precision, using the porch posts and railings for cover as bullets splintered wood around them. Eleanor's first shot took down one of the attackers, her father's rifle barking with authority in her steady hands. Tom's return fire was measured and accurate, each shot calculated to force the attackers to seek cover rather than press their assault. The ranch yard became a battlefield, but it was a battlefield where Tom and Eleanor held the advantage of position and purpose. They weren't just defending property, they were defending the idea that people could build something lasting, something that couldn't be stolen by men with more money than honor. Webb's tactical plan was falling apart, and Tom could see uncertainty spreading among the hired guns. The question was whether Webb would retreat and regroup, or escalate to the kind of violence that would leave no room for negotiation. The gunfight continued for several minutes before Tom noticed something that changed everything: fresh hoofbeats approaching from the east, moving fast. In the moonlight, he could see riders cresting the hill, and his heart sank as he counted at least 8 more men. "Eleanor," he said grimly, "we've got company coming." But as the riders drew closer, Tom realized something was wrong with his assessment. These weren't more of Webb's hired guns, they were riding in formation, with military precision and discipline that Webb's mercenaries lacked. "Hold your fire!" a commanding voice called out across the battlefield. "This is Colonel Morrison, United States Army. Cease hostilities immediately." Webb's men, caught between Tom and Eleanor's defensive position and Morrison's cavalry patrol, found themselves suddenly outnumbered and outgunned. The colonel had brought a full squad of soldiers, men who moved with the professional competence of regular army troops. Webb himself looked stunned. "Colonel, you're early. We weren't expecting." "I wasn't expecting to find you conducting a military assault on civilian property, Captain." Morrison's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "Stand down, your men, and prepare to explain yourself." Tom stepped out from cover, his rifle lowered but ready. In the lamplight from the porch, Colonel Morrison was exactly as Tom remembered. Grey-haired, with the bearing of a career officer who'd earned his rank through competence rather than politics. "Major Avery," Morrison said, dismounting and approaching the porch. "You look well, considering the circumstances." "Colonel, I appreciate your timing." Morrison's eyes took in the battle-scarred ranch yard, the defensive positions Tom and Eleanor had established, and the way they stood together with the confidence of partners rather than employer and employee. "Mrs. St. James, I presume." Morrison tipped his hat to Eleanor. "Your telegram was quite persuasive. It's been too long since I've had the opportunity to set the record straight regarding the Dakota incident." Webb had dismounted as well, his face flushed with anger and frustration. "Colonel, this man is a traitor and a coward. His actions in Dakota resulted in the deaths of 3 soldiers under his command." "His actions in Dakota," Morrison replied coldly, "prevented the massacre of 37 Lakota civilians, including 14 children, actions that were in direct accordance with military law and basic human decency." The colonel reached into his jacket and pulled out an official document. "I have here the complete military record of the Dakota incident, including witness statements from the surviving members of Major Avery's command. Would you like me to read Sergeant Patterson's testimony about your orders to kill them all and let God sort them out?" Webb's face went pale. "Those records are classified." "Those records," Morrison interrupted, "were declassified last month when the territorial governor requested a full investigation into military conduct during the Indian conflicts. It seems your current employers weren't the only ones interested in Major Avery's service record." Eleanor felt a surge of vindication and relief. The truth was finally coming out, and the man she'd come to love was being vindicated by someone who'd witnessed his actions firsthand. Morrison continued, his voice carrying across the ranch yard so that everyone could hear. "The official record shows that Major Avery's actions were not only justified, but exemplary. When faced with illegal orders, he chose to protect innocent lives at the cost of his own career. The 3 soldiers who died were volunteers who shared his moral conviction." Tom felt the weight of 3 years' shame beginning to lift from his shoulders. "Colonel, I still made mistakes that night. Good men died because I couldn't find a better way. Good men died because they chose to do what was right, Tom. Just as you did. The only mistake was mine, in allowing political pressure to result in your court-martial instead of Captain Webb's." Webb's hired guns were beginning to edge toward their horses, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation had developed. Fighting a widow and a disgraced ex-soldier was one thing. Facing a colonel and a squad of regular army troops was quite another. "This isn't over," Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, it is." Morrison nodded toward his men, who had quietly surrounded Webb's remaining fighters. "You're under arrest for assault, conspiracy, and attempting to defraud a civilian of legal property. Your employers at Mountain Development Company are facing federal charges for fraudulent land claims and conspiracy to commit violence." Eleanor stepped forward, her father's rifle still in her hands. "What about the mineral rights? The copper deposits?" Morrison smiled, the expression of a man who enjoyed delivering good news. "According to the Territorial Surveyor's Office, those geological reports were falsified. There's iron ore on your land, Mrs. St. James, but no copper deposits of any commercial value. Mountain Development Company was running an elaborate fraud, probably planning to take investors' money and disappear." The revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. All of this, the threats, the violence, the attack on Eleanor's ranchard, been based on fabricated geology reports and forged documents. Eleanor felt laughter bubbling up in her chest, the slightly hysterical laughter of someone who'd been through too much stress and was finally seeing relief. "So they were trying to steal my ranch for mineral deposits that don't even exist?" "I'm afraid so, which makes their methods even more reprehensible." Morrison turned to Tom. "Major, I have something that belongs to you." The colonel reached into his jacket and pulled out a familiar object, Tom's original commission and service record, cleared of all charges and officially restored. 6 months later, Tom stood in the same spot where he'd first seen Black Hollow Ranch, but everything had changed. The gates were freshly painted, the road was smooth and well-maintained, and the ranch buildings gleamed with the care of people who took pride in their work. The cattle in the pastures were sleek and healthy, and the sound of laughter carried from the main house where Sarah was preparing for the evening celebration. Eleanor emerged from the house wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. She'd stopped wearing only black after the trial ended, and the change in her appearance reflected the change in her spirit. The grief was still there, it always would be, but it was balanced now by hope and the quiet contentment of a woman who'd found her way back to living. "The surveyor finished his report," she said, approaching Tom with a smile. "The iron ore deposits are actually quite valuable, just not in the way Webb's people claimed. We're looking at steady income for the next 20 years if we manage it properly." Tom nodded, but his attention was focused on Eleanor herself, rather than the financial details. Over the past months, he'd watched her transform from a woman trapped by grief into someone who embraced both the sorrows and joys that life offered. The change had been gradual but profound, like watching a flower bloom after a long winter. "There's something else," Eleanor continued, her hand going to the chain at her throat. But instead of the heavy gold wedding ring she'd worn there for 3 years, she now wore a simple locketone that still contained pictures of James and Billy, but also had room for new memories. "I've been thinking about what you said, about learning to carry the dead differently." She opened the locket to show him the pictures inside. James and Billy's photographs were still there, but they'd been joined by a new picture run of Tom and Eleanor taken on the day the trial ended, both of them smiling with the relief of people who'd survived something that could have destroyed them. "I realized that loving you doesn't mean forgetting them," Eleanor said quietly. "It means honoring what they gave me by being brave enough to love again." Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion. The past 6 months had been a journey for both of them, not just clearing his name and securing the ranch, but learning to trust that some good things were meant to last. "Eleanor," he said, reaching into his pocket to pull out his father's silver dollar. The coin gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, worn smooth by generations of handling. "My father gave me this when I was 18. Told me a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by what he was willing to sacrifice for what was right." He held the coin out to her, and Eleanor could see the inscription worn into its surface. "For honor, for truth, for love. I've carried this through cavalry charges and court-martials, through 3 years of wandering and wondering if I'd ever find a place where I belonged. But I understand now what he meant." Tom's voice was steady but emotional. "The most valuable thing I can sacrifice is my fear of losing something precious again. My fear of not being worthy of love." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as Tom knelt beside her, offering not just the coin but everything it represented: his past, his present, and his faith in their future together. "Eleanor St. James, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you let me spend the rest of my life proving that some destinies are worth waiting for?" Eleanor's answer was to kneel beside him, taking the silver dollar in one hand and his face in the other. "Yes, Tom Avery. Yes, to all of it." Their kiss was witnessed by Pete, who'd emerged from the barn just in time to see his boss and the best ranch hand he'd ever worked with find their way to each other. The old cowhand smiled and quietly retreated, giving them privacy for a moment that had been building since Tom's first night at the ranch. The wedding took place a month later in the parlor of the ranch house, with Colonel Morrison serving as Tom's best man, and Sarah weeping happy tears as she watched Eleanor promise to love and honor a man who'd proven himself worthy of both. Pete walked Eleanor down the aisle in place of the father she still missed, and the ceremony was simple but perfect. But it was the moment after the vows that meant the most to Tom. Eleanor had surprised him by commissioning a new brand for the ranch, not replacing her father's mark, but adding to it. The new design combined the original St. James brand with Tom's initials, creating something that honored the past while embracing the future. "It's our ranch now," Eleanor had said as they looked at the design together. our legacy to build and protect and pass on. As Tom stood in the evening light, 6 months after that desperate night when Webb's men had threatened everything they held dear, he marveled at how completely his life had changed. The ranch was thriving under their joint management, the legal troubles were permanently resolved, and the woman he loved stood beside him as his partner in every sense of the word. Eleanor joined him at the fence, slipping her hand into his as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The silver dollar was now part of their shared treasure, kept in the safe along with the deed to the ranch and the other documents that proved their right to this land and this life. "Any regrets?" Eleanor asked, echoing a conversation they'd had on their wedding night. Tom considered the question seriously, as he always did. "About my past? About the choices that led me here? No. Every mistake, every failure, every year of wandering brought me to this place. To you. Some destinies, it seems, really do wait until a man's near the end of the trail before they reveal themselves." Eleanor smiled and leaned against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that they'd both found their way home or not, just to a place, but to each other. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered and love that had been tested and proven true. In the distance, cattle lowed softly in the gathering dusk, and the ranch settled into another peaceful evening under the vast Montana sky.